All right, that's two-dimensional arrays and nested for loops. This will be the first of at least two, maybe three videos. I'm going to go through this slow. Like I left in the announcements, I strongly suggested that you all read the book. Having said that, I know there's some that are just totally opposed to reading the book. So my suggestion for you is, if you didn't read it, to please watch this video or the videos after this at least a couple of times. All right, this is one of those things that you really need to totally absorb before we move on, because it's not going away. This isn't a one-off where we just we run through these for loops and that's it. You'll be using it actually in all your future classes as well as this one. All right, let's just start from the top. I've defined a string array, and I've called it my array, and it's two-dimensional. Two-dimensional is back-to-back square blocked numbers. Actually, those will become constants in the next video, but I want to give you a feel for what we're doing, so I'm just using numbers right now. So what you're looking at is a 3x3 two-dimensional array called my array, right? What I did is just went ahead and hard-coded and assigned these names to it. All right, I got 9 three-letter names: Joe, Jim, John, Don, Dan, Dre, Sam, Saul, Stu. This is how you, and will be the same way that you would put in ints or characters. You're going to put them in. There's going to be overriding two brackets, right? Each row will have its own bracket with each of the items separated by commas. In this case, because it is strings, I've got quotation marks, double quotation marks around the name. Had this been integers, it would have just been 1, 6, 7. Had this been chars, characters, this would have been single quotation H, single quotation mark, a set of quotation marks with a G. But you would need the brackets just like this for anything else, for any of the other characters. I mean, the other elements. All right. So now we have a 3x3 array, and it's totally populated with 9 things. I want you to realize what the numbering of this. All right. In order, Joe, all right, is my array 0, 0. It's in the upper left-hand corner. All right. Jim is my array 0, 1, because it's in the first row, second column. Remember, we start out with 0 and we count from there. Right? John is my array 0, 2. You can go through it. Finally, we end up with all the way down with Stu. Stu is down in the lower right-hand corner. It's my array 2, 2. The one thing I want you to realize, this is how my array sees it, but in memory, this is 9 different places in continuous memory. It's really not in a grid in memory. All right, now my array's full. I want to print it out. How do you print it out? You don't want to print C out my array 0, 0, my array 0, 1. You don't want to go do that. It's a lot of extra work. And besides that, you're going to have to get really fluent with nested for loops. I'm going to print this out with a nested for loop. By nested, I mean we got an outer for loop and we got an inner for loop. The outer for loop has eyes in it. Eyes for counters, eyes for incrementing, eyes for checking condition. And the inner for loop has J's. Right? They have to be different. So let's talk about what goes on here in this. This all this is going to do is print out each element in the two-dimensional array. The first one it prints out, and I'm going to walk you through this, will be it's going to print out my array 0, 0, which we can see from up here is going to be Joe. So it's going to print out Joe first, then Jim, then John, then Don, Dan, Dre. Okay, here's how it works. Int I equals 0, while I is less than 3, that's the condition, and it's met. Obviously, if I is 0, it meets the conditions. 0 is less than 3, then I plus plus, right? The postfix means it'll increment, all right, after this, it'll increment here, right? After it gets down at the end of everything inside these brackets, that's when it'll increment. All right, so I equals 0, all right? It starts inside the inner for loop. It goes down to this one, and then it checks the conditions of J. J equals 0, J is less than 3, J plus plus, right? Right, all those conditions are met. J is 0, J is less than negative, J equals 3, J is less than 3, and we're going to go ahead and print out this inner line, which right now prints out I0, J0, which is M, right? This goes all the way down to the end of the inner for loop. Then this J plus plus increments. All right, increments, it goes back up to the top. It doesn't go back up to the top of the outer for loop. What happens here is this inner for loop has to exhaust itself before this gets down to this bracket, and it increments and kicks back out to the I. All right, so it's got to work through this, and this inner for loop is the row. All right, it's going to work through this whole row, whether this row is 240 or the 3 that you're just looking at right here. It just keeps looping and doing this row. J stays at 0. I stays at 0, but J increments each time. All right, so you're going to stay on row 0 because I hasn't incremented. You're just working on this inner for loop. All right, so I increments. I was 0, I increments, I is 1. We go back up to the top of this for loop. 1 is less than 3. So this runs again, except this time I equals 0, because it's still on the inner for loop. I equals 0, but now J equals 1. It's going to print out, oh, I made a mistake here. This is Joe. Now it's going to print out Jim. All right. After it prints out Jim, it goes down here. J increments again. We're still on this inner for loop. J increments. J is now 2. We check the condition. 2 is still less than 3. All right. Then it goes down to this and runs again. I equals 0, J equals 2. So this is going to be my array 0, 2, which you can tell from up here, that is John. Right. So J increments again, J becomes 3. We go back up here and check it. J is no longer less than 3. We are done for now with this middle, the inner for loop. It goes all the way down to here, right? I increments. Now I has been 0 all along. Now that we've kicked all the way down to here, we go back to the start of the outer for loop. Now I equals 1. Is 1 less than 3? Yes. All right. Right. Now we're back at the inner for loop again. The only difference is now I equals 3. So we're going to be working on this row now, but now J starts over at 0. J is 0. I is 1. So this is 1, 0. We go up here and we see that's Don. That out, J increments, j is 1 now. So now we have I equals 1, j equals 1. And we're going to see out Dan. J increments again. So j is 2. I is still 1 because we're still working on this row. We're just constantly looping through this middle row. All right. So I equals 1, j equals 2. We output my array 1, 2, and that is Dre. J increments again, goes back to the top of the for loop. It's now 3. J is no longer less than 3. So it kicks out of this, goes back to the outer for loop to the end. It increments. I becomes 2. Now we're going to be working on the second row, right? We're back once again in this inner for loop, just working on a row. So I is 2 now. So j is back to being 0 again. So this is going to be 2, 0, which is Sam. Increments, goes back. J is now 1. 1 is less than 3. This runs again. So it's my array 2, 1. Tall. Right? We're at the end of the inner for loop. It goes back. J is 2 now. 2 is less than 3, so it runs again. So we've got my array 2, 2, because I equals 2, j equals 2, and our final one is Stu. Right? It kicks out. It goes back. I increments I equals 3. All right. We go back and test that against the outer for loop. All right. It's done. So this kicks out and we're down here. It's exhausted itself. We went through all 9 of the different cells. Not cells. I mean, I call it cells, but it's places in memory for these 2-dimensional arrays. So let's run the debugger and you can see this. All right, there's the 9 names. They're in order. If I want to make this look in a 2-dimensional array, if I want to make this look like a 2-dimensional array, all I do is go to the end of the inner for loop and see out endl. Right? That endl, what that does is after it works all through all the rows, it'll go back and make it start again a new row at the front. Okay, so I'm going to run this now. And you can see, there we are in a 3x3 grid. And all you do to make it do that is put an endl after the inner for loop. Because the inner for loop works through a row. And then after you've worked through a row, if you hit an endl, it goes down and starts on the next row as I increments. All right, that's for somebody that's not familiar with this, that's a lot to take in. If you need to, rewatch the video and pay close attention to how the variables increment and you work your way through this.